All right, here's our first presentation about the Israel stele.
So this is the Israel stele.
Sometimes with an E at the end.
Stele. Okay, so some background about it. It was originally found in Merneptah's funerary chapel in Thebes. It's made of ivory, I believe.
I don't think it's made out of ivory.
That's what I found on the archaeology website.
Really?
Yeah, but like I said, I didn't know how accurate it was, and I didn't want to, so I just stopped looking.
No, I don't think so. It's probably made out of. Ivory is like a tusk of
that's what I thought was weird, but I don't know.
No, I would say it's probably made out of diorite or it's a dark, heavy stone. I don't think it's basalt. I think it's diorite. That's
off to a great start.
That's okay.
So the Israel stela. See, now it's messing me up. Stela. That's how I would say. Stela was written in response to the victory of Amenhotep III from western Thebes over the Libyans who invaded Egypt from the west. So that's a lot of words. But basically, the whole stela is accounting of the wins that they had over the people of the west.
All right.
But what's interesting is it very subtly mentions a victory over someone from the east who are the Israelites. And it just gives like a very small account that the ancient Israelite nation, ancient Israel did exist. The stela was written so that the Egyptians would remember the victories of the people. So it wasn't written with the Israelites in mind just to preserve their history, but it was written to preserve how the Pharaoh was a victorious Pharaoh, and he was valiant. It speaks primarily of the defeats of the nations to the west of Egypt, but I already said that, I'm sorry. And then many translators interpret the Israel stela as a poem, but the book that we are using translates it as a poem as well, but they have to convert it to English so it doesn't sound that way. And they also just really highlight the fact that the king is asserting his position over Egypt's neighbors. The background. So I think it actually looks like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But this was just one of the pictures that I found.
Right.
The stela was written during the period under the rule of Majesty Re Harakiti. And what I was telling you about earlier, how I just had trouble interpreting it, there were so many names that were used for this particular king. So Mighty Bull, Possessor of Strength, the Unique One, and the King of Lower and Upper Egypt.
Right.
I didn't really know
who
exactly.
The Pharaoh has lots of titles.
Yeah.
And so, he can string off 20, 30 things that are names or titles of the Pharaoh.
Which I understand, but I think what I had trouble understanding was the fact that, it mentioned his name, the Majesty of Re Harakiti, once, and then the rest of the times he was referred to as a different name. But I also think that that's something that we can learn from their culture, is that they have different names for their pharaohs, just like how we have different names for God, Emmanuel. And if somebody were to read the Bible and go through all of the names that we have for God, they wouldn't understand it without having the background. So understanding that that's what they did, they had different names for him, really helps us understand their literature more. And through the stela, writing it and just having an account of his victories, he was hoping to encourage Mott, that everybody would kind of stay in their lane and do the best that they can with what position they were given in this world.
Right order.
So another thing I had trouble interpreting, but it sounded like, I know that he was a valiant king, and he just, his purpose was to take over, basically be imperialistic, which is interesting because Egypt it's very remote, but it had very strong international relations. And when people remembered his I'll just read this. When the people remembered his victories, he wanted them to notice They occurred in all lands, so they would remember his valiancy and dutifulness to the nation of Egypt. And all the neighboring nations feared him. And I put a quote on here. Their vanguard turned tail, their legs could not stand firm, but ran. Their archers discarded their bows, their runners' hearts were weary with moving on. The vile enemy chief of Libya fled all alone in the deep of the night. And that just like pictures how people viewed Egypt. And in a way, I don't mean to like bring Donald Trump into this, but the Pharaoh was the neighbor. I mean, the Pharaoh was the representation of Egypt as a whole. So however the Pharaoh acted and made Egypt, and however he conveyed his nation to be, that's how neighboring people saw him. So they don't know what's going on in Egypt because it's so remote. But if they saw how he was treating their country, then that's how they're going to perceive all Egyptians. And in the same way, like when we look at, when other countries look at Donald Trump, or if you look at other leaders like Kim Jong-un, you know, wow. People perceive.
Donald's in quite a group there.
I don't mean that. Okay. I'm not saying that I'm like labeling him, but I'm thinking of like big names, you know. We perceive an entire country based off of their leader. And I think that that's probably what happened then, especially because they don't have any pictures to show how life is actually in Egypt. They just have their international relations and whoever represented them.
Right.
And because, and how the reason they feared them was because he would command his army to take he would command his army to take the food out of Libya. So they would steal the flour so that they couldn't eat. That he would also abduct their wives and do it in front of their husbands. And he would also murder them, but like he would kind of torture them until he killed them. So when it says the chief of Libya fled all alone in the deep of the night, it also said later that, like, in a day's time, all of Libya just up and left, and it was abandoned, which is really interesting. Oh, in a day's time, Libyans abandoned their goodly habitat of the countryside because of the persecution from the Egyptians. So if we know that this is what was happening in Libya, we can also infer that what happened in Israel, even though we don't have much, like, historical documentation of what happened to the Israelites and how they were brought into Egypt, the Libyans like completely left. So I imagine that all of Israel was destroyed, and they were, as they were slaves, like they all had to come in one day, or they were just all marched there, which is crazy. Like if you imagine like all of one country being marched into another, it's insane. They found it safer to hide in a cave than in their own homes, and feared that what they knew as the Black Land, a term for the dark alluvial soil of the Nile Valley. So that's also evidence for how they viewed the whole country rather than just the... because of what the Pharaoh did, that's how they viewed the whole country. The whole country is the Black Land. And how do people look at, like I was saying with Donald Trump, how do people look at America? They think that we're like entitled and privileged, which we are in a sense, but like, is everyone in America entitled and privileged just because our leadership is? Probably not. That's a very big stereotype. So we have to be careful when we're like reading the literature, how other countries view it.
Sure. Yeah, that's good.
The international relations reflected the way the Pharaoh treated the rest of the world, and nations are perceived by... I already said that, sorry. Okay, so why is it called the Israel Stela? I already touched on this, but... Oopsie.
Oh.
What did I can fix it.
Let's go to the percent.
I was looking for the little button.
Yeah, because it's not actually PowerPoint.
Oh, there it is. Okay. So here's Egypt. I'm sure you guys have better geography than me, but here's Israel up here, and then Libya. So it was all, like, the majority of the stela is talking about everything that's happening in the West. What countries were being taken over here. but because of one little mention of Israel, like literally in one line, that's why it says, and I don't have the quote on here. I should have included it of where it says Israel, but you'll have to take my word for it. But because of the one little line, we have documentation that there was an ancient Egypt before. I'm not sure if it was before the time that they were enslaved, but I think
this would be after. This would be after the Exodus.
Okay, but regardless, it's still like a really big proof. And those are my references.
All right.
This was the link that I used for that. The archaeology.
I.L. Williams. Okay.
But.
Well, all right. Thank you. Yes, this we mentioned this in class before when we talked about the date of the Exodus. This is the only mention of Israel in any Egyptian text.
Was that accurate, like how I just described it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that was good. Let's see, is this still...
That stuff is hard to read for me.
Okay. It is now working.
Yay.
The Blinding of Truth by Falsehood.
Yeah, The Blinding of Truth by Falsehood. When I heard this, I thought it was going to be much more a wisdom text.
Right.
I noticed, because the last one I picked was completely different than what I initially thought it was going to be. And this one was the same. I thought it was going to be one way, and it ended up being much more...
Ended up being another.
Yeah, it ended up being much more allegorical than it was a story. So it was pretty interesting. Some of the context of this is just one picture of it. They had about 25 pictures in a gallery on some...
Chester Beatty Papyri too?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes. It was written in the New Kingdom during the 19th dynasty. It is also known as the Papyrus Chester Beatty II. It was found in Thebes. The beginning is not very well intact. We don't have all of it, but the ending part is pretty well intact, and that's what we're seeing here. So, what happens in this story?
Ooh.
So
Very relaxing story.
There are two brothers. There's truth and there's falsehood. So falsehood has this dagger that he gives to his brother truth, and he lends it to him. And in some way, truth mishandles it. Something happens to the dagger, and falsehood gets mad, so he tells his men to get truth and blind him. And so truth ends up getting blinded by falsehood. So after a few days, he's walking. He ends up he's sleeping under a tree at some point. And this lady, who we don't know her name, they just call her N in the writing.
Nancy.
Maybe it might be Nancy. She sees him, and she has her maidservants and all that. She says, "Let's bring this man in." Because she starts desiring this man.
Uh-oh.
She desires after this handsome man and his body. And then it goes straight into saying she brings him into their house. They have sexual intercourse. And she gets pregnant with a boy. Which I wasn't expecting reading this, but...
So this would be the son of truth.
The son of truth, yeah.
Son of truth.
So as he grows...
We'll call him Veritas, just to keep it Latin.
Say it again?
We'll call his name Veritas. That's Latin.
We don't know the boy's name.
I know. We're just giving it.
But when he grows up, but when he gets a bit older, he gets mocked by a lot of school children because they say, "You don't know who your father is. You don't know his name." Yeah. That must be hard for a kid.
We know what that's like.
So he asks his mother. Funny thing is, though, she says who his dad is, and then he says that he's pretty much saying, your family should have gotten a crocodile and killed you because of your immorality. He says that to his mom.
He tells his mother that?
Yeah, he says, like, wow, you you're a hoe.
So, what? Wait a minute, hold on.
I mean,
A thought.
I assume,
yes.
I assume you're talking about a gardening tool.
no. I wouldn't call my mother that. I promise.
I hope not.
I wouldn't call her. But, yeah, he pretty much calls her.
So he lets his mother have it. He's
He
upset
does.
because everybody teases
Yeah.
him. He knows his father, and then
He doesn't
he
know his,
finds out what happened. He doesn't like
he
it.
doesn't know who his daddy is, and he calls his mom a hoe, and he just seems to have a lot of problems with his parents.
So dysfunctional family
Yeah.
date all the way back to the ancient Egypt.
Yep. So he finds out, his mom tells him, oh, it's that blind guy sitting over there, named Truth. He's like, oh, okay. So he goes, helps his dad out, like gets him a footstool, gives him food and water. He says, who was the guy who blinded you? He said, oh, it's my brother named Falsehood. So he says, I'm going to avenge you. The real first Avenger.
Oh.
Yes. So
now it's become a Marvel comic.
it has now become part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So he ends up going to Falsehood, and he wants to get vengeance for his dad. So then he ends up traveling to Falsehood's herdsman, and he has this ox. He takes this ox with him. He takes some food, like 10 loaves of bread.
Veritas has an ox.
Yes. He gives the ox. It's this massive ox, and he gives it to Falsehood's herdsman, and says, "Take care of it until I come back." So he leaves it there. It was weird because it said after a few days the ox had been there several months. It was very weird. I was very confused at the word.
Yeah, well,
but
that's the way life is.
who knows? So Falsehood gets there and he says, "Give me this ox. I want to eat it. I'm hungry." And they say, "This isn't your ox." He said, all these oxen are my oxen. Give me this one in particular. So he ends up appropriating it. Is the wording they use.
Appropriate.
He pretty much eats the ox, and the boy comes back, finds this out, and says, "Where's my ox?" "Oh, you ate it. Give me a new one that's as big as mine." They don't have one. And then it strangely transitions to them talking to the Ennead, which is kind of like the Supreme Court that we have now.
Council of Gods.
Yeah, there's 9 different gods.
So in the Marvel universe, this would be the...
You'd have to ask someone else.
Yeah,
I'm not fluent in that. So he takes them to the Ennead, and they say, "You're lying, young boy. There is no ox like this." And he says, "Well, do you know about this dagger that is Falsehood's that he blinded my father for?" And Falsehood makes a promise that if they find his dad alive, if they find Truth alive, he will have his 2 eyes blinded, and he'll become the doorkeeper at his brother's home. And so they end up finding Truth, and so they blind Falsehood. They take his eyes out. He becomes a doorkeeper, and then the last line is, "Thus it concludes happily and successfully."
You sure?
Yeah.
There you go.
So apparently, by this,
happily ever after because he has been avenged.
yeah, man has gotten his eyes plucked out, and we're all happy now. So it's a very happy ending, I guess.
You always pick the best pictures.
Yeah, I had to pick.
That was a good one.
But conclusion, yes. So typically, Truth is portrayed by Mott when it's personified,
Right.
but in this allegory, it's pictured as a young man, which is a bit different. There's a theme of sibling rivalry, similar to the tale of the 2 brothers, and there's a body of justice, the Ennead. This would be the Ennead. There are 10 there, but sometimes Horus is not. I believe it's Horus that isn't included. Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. But there's a sense of justice throughout this entire story. Justice should be served. And another interesting aspect to the ending of this story is that there isn't an overwhelming victory over evil or the enemy, the antagonist. It's more so a compromise is reached, which I find unique. Typically, when we like some superheroes movie or something like that, usually, as long as there's not a cliffhanger, the main villain ends up getting thrown in jail, dies, banished, something happens. It's not, all right, let's work something out, and, we'll end on a peace treaty. So it's interesting that the resolution here is that one man was blinded, and another man was blinded, and in a way, it's a compromise. So neither is purely good, neither is purely evil. There's much more balance in this. And references.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, I like that. And I like the pictures, too. So we got truth and falsehood. The blinding of truth by falsehood. It happens every day, doesn't it? I don't know quite what's going on here with this, but let me get out of this first. I'm hoping this has all been recorded, but I don't see it now. I don't see it up here. This was very strange. So let me get rid of that one. Because, see, it doesn't look like it's recording it here. It says it is recording. Click here to pause.
Christmas is safe.
It's a Christmas miracle.
Okay. So,
What is it? It's a winter wish. Is that what they're called? SEU?
sounds very
They have a
secular
box
to
and you
me.
put the stuff in it. What was that thing you guys just filled out?
Winter wishes. Winter demands.
Demands. Oh. All right.
Oh boy.
The famine.
The famine stela. So this is a stela found sort of by Elephantine, I believe.
Okay.
And I was actually really interested in this. I thought it was going to be sort of like a almost a poetic historical text, but it wasn't exactly. It was like big, giant paragraphs and paragraphs of information talking about this guy.
One thing we can learn is the titles don't actually indicate what the text is about.
Yeah. So it actually basically acts as a big record of the history of a certain event, but it might actually be like some early fake news, and I'll get into that a little bit later.
Fake news.
So,
Fake news.
I shouldn't have used that term. So it was written roughly in the Ptolemaic period, around 270, but the inscription deals with information that was happening in like 2600 BC. So it was a way later thing, written about a way earlier thing. So it is about this distraught pharaoh Djoser, who is who is dealing with a famine in Egypt, and they use the term 7 lean years in Egypt, which we see a lot in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, and Egyptian cultures, which kind of applies a neat historical event probably actually did happen at the time. And he is seeking a way to end this famine, and he is visited in a dream by the fashioner god Khnum. And this is really interesting because Khnum seemed to almost be not exclusively worshipped in Elephantine, but that seemed to be the main center of his worship. And Khnum talks about how he had been giving this pharaoh jewels and materials to make his temple good with all this time, and that nobody had ever been doing anything with it. And in return for establishing an order of priests and repairing Khnum's temple, Khnum promises to stop the famine and to allow the drought to discontinue. And this is the actual stela.
Whoa.
It's got a giant, cool crack in the middle. It looks pretty metal to me. But
Where was this found?
Elephantine, I believe.
Elephantine. And it's still there.
I think so.
Okay.
This might have actually, I think maybe that there's like guards around this now or something. But It might actually be removed. I'm not sure how old this picture is. It might be in a museum somewhere. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Would be pretty big to move.
Yeah. So it was around here. Is where it was found.
Okay.
Around the island of Elephantine.
Yeah.
Right there. And this is interesting to me because it may actually be propaganda made by the priests at
Fake news.
at Elephantine to try to have funds sent to them
It's
by other.
probably written by CNN.
Oh boy. Anyway, to sort of written way later to make Khnum a more important god during the Ptolemaic period, to get funds to keep the temple kept up. And another thing, they glorify Khnum in a weird way that isn't usually consistent with how you would glorify gods other than like Re, or like Chu, or things like that. And if I can get into the okay, I guess I'll talk about this first. So, though it is written as a historical account, it's actually more of like a hymn, not a hymn exactly, but a praise text, like a long section of prose dedicated to glorifying this god Khnum, sort of subliminally talking about how great he is and how he solved this Pharaoh Djoser's problem. So, they also do a lot of things like associate him. He's the fashioner, so they associate him with like jewelry smithing and stone carving and things like that. And something that was really weird is that they had this phrase in here that Khnum was as eternal as the foremost gods. Like he was around, not first necessarily, but at least as long as any other god.
Right.
And here's some excerpts from the text talking about that.
I am
Your fashioner. And this part talks about like sort of how he had given pharaohs jewels to make temples with, materials to do things with, and that they hadn't done enough. Not that he was mad with anyone, just that it's because of this that I have to let the drought continue. And then later in this part, he talks about basically being as prime as some of the more powerful gods. Which I think that wasn't as common at the time in Egypt to consider this until after these priests at Elephantine sort of made this stela. So that's
fake news.
Fake news. I'm not sure exactly. I would have to research this a little bit more. I'm not sure exactly how powerful Khnum was considered before this point, but this text definitely was trying to make him seem like a pretty big member of the pantheon, or not pantheon. What do the Egyptians have?
In this pantheon. I mean, that's a Greek name.
I know it's a Greek term, but
yeah,
basically it's a propaganda piece for Khnum by the priests of Elephantine to get some cash.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my sources.
Probably written by the Russians.
Any questions?
Okay, so what? So yeah, that's fascinating. The famine steals. So in the end, the famine is over,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, "Look."
Well, actually, it's he promises. Khnum promises that the famine will be over, and the pharaoh goes home happy. It doesn't actually end. He's just like, oh, I feel better about this now.
Because it's going to end.
Yeah, it's gonna end.
It's going to end. It hasn't ended. It's kind of like this semester.
This semester has been the fastest one ever, for sure.
It is. We were just talking about that.
I didn't even notice it happen.
I think it's even faster than last semester with Irma. And that was a fast semester.
Yeah, that was like nothing got done.
Yeah.
It was awful for people teaching school. It was great for everyone who had a break. But
Did you feel stressed last year for Irma?
I had to take a bath in a pot.
Here's our final one of the hour. The prophecy of the Lamb. Good title.
Yes, it is. All right, so you can see I did my presentation on the prophecy of the Lamb. Not exactly what you guys might think. It doesn't really have much biblical connotation to it, but I did find how interesting how accurate it ended up turning out to be. So who knows?
Ooh, there's a nice lamb.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty cute lamb, so I thought that would be pretty
Very
accurate.
tasty.
Yeah, that's really what I was thinking too. So yeah,
Fake news.
Fake news. CNN, you are fake news. All right. It was written by an Egyptian historian named Manetho during the reign
Manetho.
During the reign of Pharaoh Bakhemrenef. So he's basically the sole ruler of the 24th dynasty. And basically this prophecy of the Lamb told about the coming destruction of the Assyrians. Well, the coming destruction of the ancient Egyptians, by the Assyrians, the Persians, and the Greeks. So, again, this was not really something written by Daniel, but I don't know if they got inspired. Some inspired version came out from it, but it was definitely pretty interesting how accurate it ended up turning out to be. So, some traditional Egyptian imagery that survived, that image is kind of covering that up, includes a river of blood, gods, and symbols of rulership and social roles that would be flipped around because of the disasters that would be unfolding. So section 1, the fate of the punishment that was to be
a nice
inflicted.
picture of the river of blood.
Yeah, this was actually a picture that kind of demonstrated Moses turning the Nile into blood. But I thought it was pretty accurate for this right here. So one thing that was for certain was the water in Egypt did become blood, and the fate of the newborn child was not regarded as safe. So that was there. And like I said before, the social roles were reversed. So let's say, for example, you got a servant. He would eventually become king. Maybe he might become king or someone that served under. And the person that was king would end up becoming the servant. So it was kind of like roles. Not necessarily gender roles that were reversed like maybe today might have happened, but definitely civil roles, as in like servanthood and kingship.
Kind of like Bizarro Superman.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. So basically, fate would not be determined or diverted from Egypt, and falsehood and evil will overtake Egypt and the temples. Yeah, haven't we heard that before? So, as you can see here, we have the different empires that have invaded. I believe this one was the Neo-Assyrians, and this was the Persians?
Yeah, it looks like it.
Yeah. So I thought that accurately demonstrated what I'd be talking about here. So a little more detail about what some of these invasions look like. Following the invasions was the Persians and the Greeks. And basically this was something else that was written in there. Woe to the youth and newborns, for they will be taken away to Syria in front of their father and mother. Can you just imagine having your newborn child as well as maybe youth just taken away into another country today? That'd be... Yeah, so that's kind of some of the disaster that they were inflicted upon, other than being attacked. Woe to Egypt, for they will weep because of how many curses are within their land. So, yeah, many other disasters to unfold too. Now, as you can see here, I did find a picture when I looked up some Egyptian lamb coffin. This is what came up with. I'm not really quite sure if that was exactly what he was buried in, but this is the closest to what the story was talking about. So basically, in the end, the Lamb concluded his prophecy, and the Pharaoh that it was spoken over during this time, he was going to see this whole disaster unfold in his life, which is, I would think, would be pretty scary if today someone told us some sort of prophecy like that today. And it was going to all unfold in just one generation. So basically, the Lamb was buried like a god, I guess, per se. I don't know how that would have worked. And where this Lamb would be particularly today. Mm-hmm. If there's really any proof that this Lamb was real, or they just made up the story. Just to explain why the many disasters were inflicted upon Egypt. Because it's not really a biblical story, but it definitely kind of sounds like it if you think about it.
Yeah.
And it has definitely biblical symbolism when it comes to the Lamb. When you also talk about the Lamb in the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament today. So, these are the references. Basically, I use the reference from the book. So, anybody have any questions about anything? What about you?
When is this prophecy dated to? Like, when was this actually written?
I cannot I didn't really look into that, and I did not see it in the book. So,
Well, you said Manetho, right?
Yeah, Manetho. That was
Well, that would be, he's in the Ptolemaic period. So he would, I think it's like 280. If it's the same Manetho that I think it is, it should date to that period, the Ptolemaic period. So this would be pretty late. So actually, if it was written by him and it was that late, then this stuff had already happened.
So it wasn't so much a prophecy; it was more like
Yeah, but unless he was writing down something that had been written earlier or talked about earlier.